Before the crisis announces itself, the world already carries the weight of its future fracture. The stage is wide, bright, and confident in its own narratives. Power circulates through institutions, symbols, flags, and rituals that promise order while quietly relying on force. The city stands as a monument to human certainty, layered with laws, hierarchies, and inherited myths about progress. It believes itself rational. It believes itself moral. It believes it knows the difference between justice and victory. Beyond that center, there is another territory. It is older, quieter, and insulated from the urgency of conquest. An island shaped by continuity rather than expansion. Its foundations are not built to grow outward, but to endure inward. The rules there are implicit rather than enforced, embodied rather than declared. Strength exists, but it is not displayed. Authority exists, but it does not compete for attention. The world functions without needing to prove itself. From that space emerges a figure who does not belong to either order, even as she is claimed by both. She is formed inside a system that does not need enemies to define itself, yet she is drawn toward a world that defines itself almost entirely by opposition. Her presence is not disruptive at first. It is quiet, composed, almost ceremonial. She enters the stage not as a challenge, but as a possibility. The myth surrounding her arrival frames her as an answer, an ideal made flesh, a synthesis between compassion and force, restraint and power. She carries no visible hunger for domination, no personal wound demanding compensation. This absence becomes her most unsettling feature. In a world structured around desire, lack, and rivalry, she arrives complete. Or at least, that is how she is read. The system watches her carefully, not with fear, but with projection. She is placed under a spotlight that exaggerates her form while flattening her interior. Symbols are attached to her quickly. Warrior, savior, proof that power does not have to corrupt. She becomes a mirror in which the world sees what it wishes it already was. This reflection comforts the audience, but it places a subtle pressure on the figure being reflected. She does not speak in absolutes. She does not rush to correct the world. Her posture suggests patience rather than urgency. Yet patience, when placed inside a culture addicted to speed and resolution, begins to look like judgment. Her silence becomes a standard. Her restraint becomes a comparison. Without intending to, she introduces a hierarchy that has nothing to do with strength and everything to do with coherence. The burden begins there, not in battle, not in tragedy, but in expectation. To be better than the world is to be measured against it constantly. Every act becomes exemplary. Every hesitation is interpreted. Every compromise is noticed. The margin for error collapses, not because she is weak, but because she is imagined as flawless. The world does not ask whether such a position is survivable. It only asks whether it can be maintained. Around her, structures of power continue to operate as they always have. Violence is justified by necessity. Control is reframed as protection. Moral language is deployed selectively, stretched to cover strategic interests. The system does not feel challenged yet. It feels validated. If someone like her exists within it, then the system must already be worthy. This is the invisible tension that precedes the fracture. A force introduced into a closed circuit, altering its balance without appearing to do so. She does not overthrow institutions. She does not expose corruption publicly. She simply exists as a counterexample. And counterexamples destabilize narratives more effectively than accusations ever could. The more she acts with restraint, the more others are forced to confront their impulses. The more she chooses mercy, the more violence elsewhere becomes visible. The contrast sharpens quietly. The arena has not erupted, but the pressure inside it is rising. There is no clear antagonist yet, no singular figure absorbing blame. The conflict is structural. It lives between ideals and their execution, between what is said and what is done, between what is celebrated and what is tolerated. She stands at the center of that gap, not by choice but by consequence. Her origin grants her clarity, but it also isolates her. She understands conflict without being formed by it. She knows suffering without being governed by resentment. This difference matters. It means she cannot fully participate in the emotional economy of the world she enters. She cannot indulge in hatred without betraying herself. She cannot surrender to cynicism without collapsing the very image that sustains her presence. The city senses this instinctively. It elevates her while testing her limits. It applauds her ideals while waiting for them to fail. There is admiration, but there is also anticipation, a quiet readiness to witness her fracture, because that fracture would restore balance. It would confirm that no one can stand above the world without eventually being pulled into its gravity. The tension does not announce itself as hostility. It appears as praise, as reliance, as the constant demand for intervention. She becomes the point where contradictions are deposited, where impossible expectations are placed, where moral debts are deferred. She is not yet broken. She is not yet divided. But the load has been assigned. To be better than the world is not to escape it. It is to carry it, and the world is heavy. Her origin does not begin with loss. This is the first divergence that defines everything that follows. She is not forged by trauma in the conventional sense, not shaped by deprivation or abandonment. She emerges from a lineage that assumes continuity, coherence, and transmission. Her formation takes place inside a symbolic enclosure designed to preserve balance rather than test it. Identity there is not negotiated through conflict, but affirmed through belonging. This environment produces a particular relationship to power. Strength is not aspirational. It is expected. It does not need to dominate in order to justify itself. Force exists as a latent capacity, regulated by shared memory and collective restraint. Violence is not absent, but it is contained, framed as a last resort rather than a default expression. This containment matters. It creates a psyche that does not equate agency with conquest. Her ethical orientation is not imposed from above. It is absorbed from the structure itself. Justice is not an abstract code. It is a lived equilibrium, maintained through repetition and ritual rather than enforcement. There is no spectacle attached to virtue, no audience, no reward. Moral action is simply how things are done. This produces clarity, but it also produces distance. When she steps outside that enclosure, she does not carry the internal fractures that define the world she enters. She understands suffering, but she does not share the same symbolic scars. Her compassion is intact, but it is not reactive. She does not seek redemption through action, because she does not feel fundamentally compromised. The world she enters is structured differently. Its foundations are built around scarcity, competition, and expansion. Identity there is forged through struggle, through the overcoming of obstacles, through differentiation from rivals. Power is visible, performative, constantly asserted. Institutions rely on narratives of protection and progress, but their legitimacy is maintained through force and spectacle. This world requires enemies. External threats justify internal cohesion. Moral language is elastic, applied strategically to sanctify necessary violence. The system does not see itself as cruel. It sees itself as realistic. Idealism is tolerated only when it can be instrumentalized. Anything that cannot be operationalized becomes decorative or suspect. Into this system arrives a figure who does not fit its internal logic. She does not need validation through victory. She does not seek recognition through dominance. Her authority does not originate from position, but from coherence. This creates an immediate but subtle disruption. Not because she challenges power directly, but because she does not desire it in the expected way. The world responds by mythologizing her. Myth is a stabilizing force. By elevating her into symbol, the system neutralizes the threat she poses as a living contradiction. She becomes an emblem of what the world claims to value, even as it continues to act otherwise. The symbol absorbs tension that would otherwise demand structural change. This mythologization also isolates her. She is no longer encountered as a subject, but as a standard. Her actions are no longer interpreted contextually, but normatively. She is not allowed ambiguity. Doubt is read as weakness. Compromise is read as failure. The complexity of her position is flattened into expectation. Her internal world begins to reorganize around this pressure. She is asked, implicitly, to mediate between irreconcilable demands, to embody mercy without undermining order, to wield force without becoming what she opposes, to remain hopeful without becoming naive. These demands are not articulated as constraints. They are framed as complements, as trust. The psychological tension emerges here. She is not torn between good and evil, but between coherence and participation. To fully integrate into the world, she would need to accept its compromises. To remain fully herself, she would need to stand apart. Neither option is clean. Both carry loss. Her restraint becomes a point of friction. Others read it as judgment, as moral superiority, as distance. This perception fuels resentment, not open hostility, but a quiet defensiveness. The system begins to test her boundaries, to place her in situations where restraint appears inadequate, where decisiveness is demanded, where hesitation carries visible cost. These moments are not accidents. They are structural. The system produces crises that require her intervention, then evaluates her response against its own priorities. When she acts with force, she confirms its logic. When she acts with mercy, she exposes its impatience. Either way, she is absorbed into the narrative. Her relationship to violence becomes especially charged. She understands its necessity, but she does not glorify it. She experiences it as weight rather than release. This stands in contrast to a culture that often frames violence as catharsis or proof of resolve. Her refusal to enjoy violence is unsettling. It deprives the act of its symbolic payoff. Around her, other figures emerge, shaped more clearly by the world's fractures. Leaders who justify cruelty through necessity. Soldiers who normalize brutality through repetition. Civilians who outsource moral responsibility upward. Each represents a partial adaptation to the system's demands. She represents something else, a refusal to adapt fully. This refusal is not framed as rebellion. It is quieter, more dangerous. It suggests that another mode of being is possible. That power does not have to corrode. That clarity can survive exposure. The system cannot easily refute this. It can only wait for it to fail. Her origin thus becomes both her strength and her vulnerability. It grants her a stable internal axis, but it also deprives her of the psychic defenses that come from fragmentation. She feels the weight of contradiction more acutely because she has not learned to compartmentalize. She cannot split herself without losing coherence. The stage is now set. The forces are in place. A world built on compromise. A figure built on integration. The tension between them is not explosive yet, but it is irreversible. The arena has been defined. The pressure will only increase. What follows is not a battle between enemies, but a slow collision between incompatible structures, and neither can remain unchanged. The first visible fractures appear not in moments of spectacle, but in moments of decision. The kind that do not announce themselves as moral crossroads, yet quietly determine the direction of an entire structure. She is placed into conflicts that are already in motion, wars whose justifications were written long before her arrival. The expectation is simple. She will resolve what others could not. She will stabilize what has already begun to collapse. Her initial interventions are measured. She listens before she acts. She attempts to understand the architecture of each conflict, rather than merely its surface violence. This approach unsettles those around her. In a system trained to equate speed with competence, her deliberation feels inefficient. In a culture that rewards decisive force, her restraint feels indulgent. Still, her presence alters outcomes. Escalations are interrupted. Civilians are spared. Certain thresholds are not crossed. These deviations are subtle, but cumulative. Each time she prevents the worst possible outcome, she also prevents the system from completing its preferred narrative arc. There is no total victory, no definitive closure, only containment. Containment is deeply unsatisfying to a world that thrives on resolution. Wars are meant to end with winners and losers. Violence is meant to justify itself retroactively. By refusing to deliver absolute outcomes, she leaves conflicts structurally unresolved. This prolongs tension rather than releasing it. The system begins to experience her not as a solution, but as an obstacle to its own catharsis. This is where polarization begins to take shape, not yet between sides, but between interpretations of her role. To some, she represents a higher standard, proof that force can be guided by restraint without collapsing into weakness. To others, she becomes a liability, someone whose ethics interfere with efficiency, someone whose reluctance to dominate prolongs instability. These interpretations harden around institutional needs. Military structures favor predictability. They require actors who will execute without hesitation. Her hesitation is not random, but it is context-dependent. It cannot be automated. This makes her difficult to integrate into command hierarchies. She does not refuse orders, but she does not surrender judgment either. Judgment is the problem. The system tolerates judgment only when it flows downward, when it can be framed as authority. Her judgment operates laterally. It questions assumptions rather than enforcing them. It exposes gaps between stated values and enacted policies. This lateral pressure destabilizes chains of justification. As conflicts intensify, the demands placed on her increase. She is sent where situations are most volatile, where moral ambiguity is greatest. Each assignment carries an implicit test. Will she finally choose decisiveness over restraint? Will she prioritize outcome over principle? Will she accept that the world cannot be saved without being shaped by force? She does not fail these tests in the expected way. She adapts, but selectively. She becomes more forceful, but not more ruthless. She learns to act faster, but not blindly. This partial adaptation frustrates the system. It offers no clean narrative. She is neither fully assimilated nor openly resistant. The psychological cost of this position begins to surface, not as doubt about her values, but as fatigue from constant mediation. She is always holding competing realities in balance. The immediate threat and the long-term consequence. The visible demand and the invisible cost. The necessity of action and the refusal to normalize brutality. This fatigue is not weakness. It is weight, a cumulative pressure created by being the point where contradictions converge. Others can externalize responsibility. She cannot. Every choice is hers. Every outcome is personal. There is no abstraction to hide behind. As violence escalates elsewhere, comparisons intensify. When atrocities occur beyond her reach, her absence is interpreted as failure. When she intervenes and prevents escalation, the lack of total victory is framed as inadequacy. The standard she is held to becomes asymmetrical. She is judged not against what others achieve, but against what might have been possible if she had acted differently. Public perception begins to shift. Admiration remains, but it becomes conditional. Support is accompanied by critique. She is praised for her intentions, but questioned for her results. The spotlight that once elevated her now magnifies every imperfection. Every hesitation becomes visible. Every compromise becomes a headline. This visibility transforms her symbolic function. She is no longer merely an ideal. She becomes a site of contestation. Different factions project their values onto her actions, interpreting the same decision in opposing ways. She becomes a screen onto which unresolved cultural tensions are projected. Internally, this projection creates strain. She remains coherent, but the environment around her grows more fragmented. She begins to recognize that her presence does not unify the world. It polarizes it, not because she incites division, but because she exposes fault lines that were already there. The realization is subtle, but irreversible. Being better than the world does not elevate it automatically. It forces the world to confront itself, and confrontation is rarely received as a gift. The conflict has now taken shape, not as a clash of enemies, but as a structural incompatibility between a figure built for integration and a system sustained by division. From here, neutrality will no longer be possible. The second phase begins when containment fails to hold. Not catastrophically, but incrementally. Conflicts she once moderated now metastasize beyond her reach. New actors emerge who are less interested in resolution than in leverage. Violence becomes communicative. It sends messages, establishes boundaries, asserts presence. The system adapts to this language quickly. It always has. She is drawn deeper into this terrain, where moral clarity no longer maps cleanly onto outcomes. Interventions require not just strength, but alignment with structures whose goals diverge from her own. Alliances are proposed that demand silence in exchange for access. Compromises are framed as realism. The language of necessity thickens around every decision. This is where polarization hardens. The question is no longer whether her values are admirable, but whether they are compatible with survival. The system begins to organize itself around this dilemma. Those who see power as inherently corrosive gravitate toward her restraint. Those who see restraint as a liability rally around decisiveness, regardless of cost. She becomes the axis of this division, even as she resists occupying it. Each refusal to fully endorse one side is read as endorsement of the other. Ambiguity collapses under pressure. The middle ground disappears, not because it is untenable in principle, but because it cannot be instrumentalized. Externally, this produces escalation. Conflicts grow sharper. Rhetoric becomes absolutist. Every act is framed as proof of allegiance. The symbolic field narrows. There is less room for interpretation, less tolerance for nuance. The arena contracts around binary choices. Internally, the pressure intensifies differently. She begins to experience the cost of coherence in an incoherent environment. To remain aligned with herself, she must absorb contradiction without discharging it outward. This creates strain, not confusion but compression. Her identity does not fracture, but it is forced to carry increasing load. Moments arise where force could end a conflict decisively, at the cost of violating her internal axis. These moments are engineered, not necessarily by malicious intent, but by structural inertia. The system produces situations where expediency and restraint cannot coexist, where delay equals death, where mercy appears indistinguishable from complicity. She acts in these moments, but never without cost. Each use of force reverberates longer than intended. Each refusal to escalate leaves a residue of resentment. There is no clean outcome, only trade-offs that accumulate. The public narrative simplifies these complexities. It always does. Decisions are stripped of context and presented as symbols. Victory or failure, strength or weakness. The subtlety of her position is flattened into slogans. This simplification feeds further polarization. People no longer respond to events, but to their symbolic framing. She becomes increasingly visible as a contested figure, not just admired or criticized, but instrumentalized. Different groups claim her actions as validation of their worldview. Others cite her limitations as evidence that ideals are impractical. Her image circulates faster than her intentions. This circulation alters her function. She is no longer merely acting within the world. She is being used to narrate it. Her presence becomes a tool in broader struggles over meaning and authority. She is referenced more than understood. The psychological consequence of this shift is isolation. Not physical solitude, but symbolic distance. Fewer encounters are unmediated. Every interaction carries expectation. Every gesture is read. She is rarely allowed to be provisional. She must always represent something. This representational burden begins to distort her relationship to action, not by paralyzing her, but by increasing the stakes of every movement. She cannot simply respond. She must consider how the response will echo, how it will be amplified, how it will be weaponized. The system, meanwhile, adjusts. It learns how to absorb her resistance without transforming itself. It accommodates her selectively, showcasing her restraint when convenient, sidelining it when inconvenient. Her presence becomes part of the machinery rather than a force acting upon it. This is the deeper conflict now emerging, not whether she can uphold her values, but whether those values can alter a structure that has learned how to metabolize dissent. The question is no longer moral. It is structural. She stands at a narrowing frontier. Ahead lies the risk of becoming an enforcer of a system she cannot fully endorse. Behind lies the risk of becoming irrelevant, a symbol without leverage. Neither position preserves integrity intact. The pressure does not resolve. It intensifies, and the world watches, not to learn, but to see which way she will break. The third movement begins when the cost of holding the center becomes undeniable. Not as a single rupture, but as a pattern that can no longer be dismissed as temporary strain. The arena has reorganized itself around extremes. Power consolidates at the edges. Institutions harden their language. The margin for restraint narrows until it resembles hesitation, and hesitation is treated as betrayal. She is no longer invited into conflicts as a mediator. She is deployed as a deterrent. Her presence is meant to signal inevitability rather than possibility. This shift is subtle in form and absolute in consequence. It transforms her from a stabilizing force into a symbolic weapon. The system does not announce this change. It simply behaves as if it were already true. She resists the role without rejecting the responsibility. This is the paradox that defines this stage. She refuses to become an instrument, Yet she continues to act within the structure that seeks to instrumentalize her. Every intervention now carries the weight of implication. To appear is to endorse. To withdraw is to abandon. There is no neutral ground left to occupy. Events accelerate accordingly. Crises are framed in ways that limit her options before she arrives. Information is curated. Timelines are compressed. The window for reflection closes early. She is presented with fait accompli and asked to validate them through action. The structure anticipates her values and uses them to constrain her movement. When she pushes back, the resistance is reframed as obstruction. When she complies partially, the compliance is amplified and the restraint erased. The symbolic field becomes hostile to complexity. Only outcomes matter. Only results count. The language of intention disappears. This is where the internal pressure reaches its most dangerous density. Not because she doubts herself, but because she recognizes the trap with increasing clarity. To continue acting is to be folded into narratives she cannot control. To stop acting is to concede the field entirely. The burden is no longer about being better than the world. It is about whether being better has any operational meaning left. The world, meanwhile, grows less patient. Admiration gives way to conditional loyalty. The standard she is measured against shifts again. She is no longer compared to human limitations, but to the idealized image the system constructed earlier. Any deviation from that image is framed as decline. Her coherence is interpreted as rigidity. Her refusal to escalate is read as fear. Opposing forces seize this moment. They frame her restraint as hypocrisy. They mirror her language of justice while emptying it of content. Violence is justified as necessary balance. Cruelty is reframed as honesty. The arena fills with distorted reflections of her values, used to legitimate their inversion. This mirroring is not accidental. It is how rival systems appropriate legitimacy. By adopting the surface of her ideals, they force her into an impossible position. To oppose them is to appear intolerant of her own language. To tolerate them is to watch that language rot from within. She confronts these figures directly at times, but the confrontations no longer clarify anything. They produce spectacle rather than resolution. Each encounter is circulated, edited, and reframed. The meaning of the event detaches from the event itself. What remains is image. This saturation of image further isolates her. She becomes hyper-visible and increasingly opaque. People feel they know her while understanding her less. Her internal axis remains intact, but it no longer aligns with the symbolic terrain around her. The ground has shifted. At this stage, force becomes unavoidable, not as indulgence, but as boundary. She acts decisively in moments where delay would collapse entire regions into chaos. These actions are effective. They save lives. They reassert limits. But they also confirm the system's suspicion that restraint was provisional all along. The aftermath of these actions is colder. Gratitude is muted. Scrutiny intensifies. Each use of force is dissected for inconsistency. Each restraint is reinterpreted as selective morality. There is no longer any assumption of good faith, only analysis. Internally, she absorbs this without fracturing, but not without transformation. Something contracts, not her values, but her expectations. She no longer believes that being better will elevate the world. She begins to understand that it may only expose it. This recognition is not despair. It is clarity. It strips away the illusion that coherence alone can reform a structure built on division. It reframes her role, not as a redeemer, not as a judge, but as a limit. Limits do not heal. They define. The conflict has now fully polarized. The system has shown its capacity to absorb, distort, and weaponize ideals. She has shown her refusal to surrender coherence, even when it costs her symbolic capital. The collision is complete. What remains is not resolution, but residue. And residue does not fade. At this stage, the conflict can no longer be contained within narrative boundaries. It spills outward, not as plot, but as pattern. What unfolds around her is no longer only about what she does, but about what her presence forces others to reveal. The story ceases to function as a sequence of events and begins to operate as a cultural instrument, reflecting anxieties that were already circulating long before she entered the stage. The figure of someone who is better than the world destabilizes collective identity. Cultures are built not only on shared values, but on shared exemptions. They require space to fail, to contradict themselves, to act brutally while maintaining a moral self-image. A figure who refuses those exemptions does not simply challenge power. She challenges permission. She exposes the quiet agreements that allow violence, exploitation, and compromise to persist without naming themselves as such. This is why the response to her presence becomes polarized. She is not received as a person, but as a demand. Different groups interpret that demand according to their own unresolved tensions. Some elevate her as proof that morality can survive exposure to power. Others resent her as an accusation made flesh. Still others attempt to neutralize her by reducing her to spectacle, transforming complexity into aesthetic. These responses are not random. They follow predictable symbolic routes. Idealization serves as containment. By placing her above the world, she is removed from it. She becomes an aspiration rather than a mirror. Resentment functions as defense. By framing her as unrealistic or naive, the system protects itself from having to change. Spectacle serves as distraction. By turning her into image, the discomfort she generates is diffused into consumption. The media environment amplifies these tendencies. Her actions are no longer experienced directly, but through layers of mediation. Clips replace context. Symbols replace processes. The speed of circulation collapses temporal distance. Decisions made under pressure are judged in retrospect as if they were leisurely choices. Complexity becomes invisible. What remains are positions. This environment favors polarization because polarization simplifies meaning. It allows individuals to locate themselves quickly within a moral map. Support or opposition, strength or weakness, idealism or realism. The figure at the center becomes less important than the identity formed in relation to her. She is the axis, but not the content. As a result, the conflict migrates from narrative to audience. Viewers do not merely watch her struggle. They rehearse their own positions through her. She becomes a proxy for debates about power, restraint, responsibility, and the legitimacy of force. Her choices are argued over, as if they were policy decisions rather than narrative events. The fiction becomes a site of social rehearsal. This rehearsal reveals something uncomfortable. Many are drawn to her not because they wish to emulate her restraint, but because they wish to outsource it. She becomes the container for moral responsibility that others do not want to carry themselves. As long as someone exists who is better than the world can continue as it is. The burden is transferred upward. This transfer is rarely acknowledged. It appears instead as admiration, praise that carries obligation, applause that demands performance. The cultural function of the ideal figure is not to inspire transformation, but to stabilize contradiction. She allows the system to believe in its values without enacting them universally. When she fails to absorb that burden fully, disappointment follows. Not because harm occurs, but because the fantasy collapses. the fantasy that goodness can exist without cost, the fantasy that someone else will carry the weight. This disappointment often mutates into critique. Her restraint is reframed as inconsistency. Her force is reframed as hypocrisy. The same actions that once inspired hope are reread through a lens of betrayal. This reversal is not evidence of changing values, but of their exposure. The audience confronts the impossibility of its own expectations and redirects the frustration outward. Symbolically, she occupies a frontier, not between good and evil, but between coherence and fragmentation. She represents the possibility of integration in a world that survives by splitting. This makes her unstable within the symbolic economy. Integrated figures cannot be easily assimilated. They resist simplification. They demand sustained attention. The culture responds by oscillating. At times she is elevated beyond critique. At others she is subjected to relentless scrutiny. This oscillation mirrors the internal conflict of a society that desires morality but resists accountability. The figure becomes a pendulum, swinging between sanctification and suspicion. This dynamic has broader implications. It shapes how power is imagined. Leaders are increasingly expected to embody moral clarity while operating within systems that reward compromise. When they fail, the failure is personalized rather than structural. The myth of the exceptional individual obscures the reality of institutional inertia. Her story thus becomes a cautionary map. It shows how ideals are absorbed, reframed, and neutralized by systems that do not share their internal logic. It reveals how symbolic elevation can function as a form of containment. It exposes how admiration can coexist with resistance to change. At the same time, her persistence disrupts complete closure. She does not collapse into cynicism. She does not surrender her axis. This refusal matters. It prevents the narrative from resolving into nihilism. The conflict remains open, unresolved, and therefore active. This openness is what grants the figure durability. She does not offer answers. She holds a question in place. What does it mean to wield power without becoming its logic? What does it mean to remain coherent in an incoherent field? What does it cost to be better, and who pays that cost? These questions echo beyond the narrative. They surface in debates about authority, justice, intervention, and restraint. They haunt discussions about leadership and responsibility. They resist final resolution because they are not problems to be solved, but tensions to be lived. Culturally, she functions as a limit case. She shows how far ideals can be stretched before they fracture. She reveals the points at which admiration becomes expectation becomes entitlement, and entitlement becomes resentment. She maps the psychic economy of idealization. This mapping is uncomfortable, which is why it is so often resisted. It is easier to argue about her decisions than to examine the structures that necessitated them. It is easier to critique her consistency than to confront the inconsistency of the world around her. Yet the figure persists, not because she triumphs, but because she does not disappear. She remains present in the cultural imagination as a reference point, a reminder that coherence is possible, even if it is costly, that restraint can exist, even if it is punished, that being better does not guarantee being embraced. Her impact is not to resolve the tension between idealism and power, but to make that tension visible and unavoidable. She turns abstraction into image. She gives form to an internal conflict that societies prefer to leave unnamed. In doing so, she becomes more than a character. She becomes a diagnostic tool, a way of reading the world that watches her, and the reading is rarely flattering. What remains after the pressure settles is not resolution, but configuration. The world does not transform itself around her presence. It adjusts. It absorbs what it can, resists what it must, and leaves the rest suspended as unresolved tension. The figure who once arrived as possibility now persists as reference. Not an endpoint, but a coordinate. Her final position is not exile, nor assimilation. It is something more difficult to articulate. She continues to act, but without illusion about the effect of action alone. She continues to intervene, but without expectation that intervention will redeem the structure she moves within. The optimism that once surrounded her has thinned into clarity. The clarity remains. This shift alters how she is perceived. The fantasy of the flawless ideal recedes. What replaces it is more ambiguous. Some interpret her endurance as stubbornness. Others read it as quiet authority. She no longer occupies the role of answer. She functions as measure, a way of seeing how far the world is willing to go and where it stops. The system responds accordingly. It no longer tries to elevate her unconditionally. It manages her. Her presence is factored into strategic calculations. She is neither embraced nor rejected outright. She becomes a constant variable, reliable in her refusal to abandon coherence, unreliable in her refusal to serve simplification. This is the legacy of being better than the world, not admiration but constraint. She defines a boundary the system cannot cross without exposing itself. That boundary does not prevent harm. It prevents innocence. The world can no longer claim it did not know another way was possible. Culturally, this is where her myth solidifies, not as triumph, but as persistence. She is remembered not for ending wars or collapsing empires, but for refusing to normalize what others accepted. Her story does not culminate in victory. It settles into pattern. That pattern becomes instructive. It shapes how audiences interpret power and morality long after specific narratives fade. She is invoked whenever restraint is dismissed as weakness, whenever force is celebrated as honesty, whenever ideals are reduced to branding. Her presence complicates those moves. It interrupts easy conclusions. Importantly, she is not remembered as pure. The narrative does not allow that. Her use of force, her moments of decisiveness, her visible contradictions prevent sanctification. This matters. A flawless symbol would be inert. A figure marked by tension remains active. The aftermath of her story reveals a deeper truth about cultural myth-making. Societies do not preserve figures who resolve their contradictions. They preserve figures who carry them visibly. Figures who hold opposing demands without collapsing into caricature. Figures who endure friction. She becomes such a figure, not because she solves the conflict between power and restraint, but because she refuses to collapse into either pole. Her endurance reframes heroism itself, not as domination, not as sacrifice, but as sustained coherence under pressure. This reframing has consequences. It alters expectations placed on leadership. It complicates the desire for saviors. It exposes the cost of outsourcing moral responsibility to exceptional individuals. When someone remains better than the world without redeeming it, the fantasy that goodness can be delegated breaks down. That breakdown is uncomfortable. It leaves responsibility distributed rather than centralized. It forces recognition that no figure can carry the burden indefinitely without distortion. Her story does not end by lifting the weight. It ends by showing that the weight exists. The world around her continues to fracture and reform. Conflicts evolve. New crises emerge. Her presence does not prevent this. It contextualizes it. She remains a reminder that escalation is a choice, even when it feels inevitable. That cruelty is often framed as necessity. That restraint is costly precisely because it resists gratification. This reminder does not inspire universal change. It inspires selective reflection. Those inclined toward power read her as caution. Those inclined toward idealism read her as warning. Both readings coexist. Neither exhausts the figure. Over time, the sharpness of immediate debates dulls. What remains is symbolic residue. An image of someone standing within the arena without becoming its logic. Someone visible without being absorbed. Someone active without surrendering interior coherence. This residue continues to operate quietly. It influences how new stories are told, how audiences respond to narratives of strength, how skepticism attaches to easy victories. Her legacy infiltrates expectation. In this way, the conflict never truly ends. It sediments. It becomes part of the cultural substrate. The tension between being better and being effective, between coherence and survival, between restraint and force, remains unresolved because it is not resolvable. Her story does not offer closure because closure would be dishonest. The world does not change simply because someone better exists within it. It changes only when structures shift. Her presence reveals this without disguising it. That revelation is her final function. Not to save the world, but to clarify it. To show what is demanded when ideals are taken seriously. To expose the cost of carrying coherence into systems that thrive on division. She remains at the frontier. Not advancing, not retreating. Holding position. The burden does not lift. It becomes visible, and that visibility endures.